On behalf of Early Career Research Committee. We have today Dr. John Mynard from the Murdoch Child Research Institute with us. He's a leader of cardiovascular bioengineering team and has been very successful with fundings from NHMRC, National Heart Foundation, Heart Kids, and so on. His research focuses on exploring new methods to assess cardiovascular disease intrauterine as well as in the neonatal period using advanced image analysis combined with computer simulations. He has in fact designed the entire circulatory system of fetus and newborn, which can be adapted to study any forms of congenital heart disease. Today he's going to take us on a walk with pediatric blood pressure. Yes, it's all yours, Dr. Johnson.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I'll just share my screen and see if we can get this working. That's my daughter there, who's turning 8 today. In fact, my computer gets slow. Here we go. All right, can you see that?
Yep.
Great. All right, well, it's a pleasure to talk to you all today, and an extra special pleasure to have some international guests here with us, particularly Professor Flynn and Ruan. Great to have you here with us. So it's a fairly short session today, half an hour. So I'll only talk for hopefully 15-20 minutes and then have a chance for some discussion. So I'm going to talk about pediatric blood pressure, and I'm, as was introduced, I'm an engineer by training, and I lead an engineering and physiology group at the Murdoch Children's. So I'm working with clinicians, and the more I delve into the pediatric cardiovascular space, the more I realise how important blood pressure, as simple as that sounds, how important blood pressure is, and doing it well. So when I start talking to people about the fact that I do research in pediatric blood pressure, one of the first questions they might ask is high blood pressure even a thing in children? And you might be asking that if you're not familiar with the paediatric space. And there was a really nice meta-analysis that came out last year on the global prevalence of hypertension in children. And just to put the results of that in context, the average school class of 25 children would have about 2.4 children with elevated blood pressure, and that's around 10%. And elevated blood pressure is defined as a blood pressure between the 90th and 95th percentile for children under 13 years of age, or 120 to 129 systolic, greater than or equal to 13 years. And then on top of that, there'll be one child in that class who has office hypertension. So that's around 4%, and that's in greater than the 95th percentile, or 130. And that requires 3 clinic visits to establish that. So if you think about an average class size having maybe 3-4 children who have elevated or hypertensive blood pressure, that is a thing. That is something there. And we also have 1 in 100 children who have stage 2 hypertension, which is defined as greater than the 95th percentile plus 12 millimeters of mercury, or more than 140. And this is really something that needs to be treated. We know also that hypertension is more common in overweight and obese children, but even in normal weight children, there's still a few in 100 will have hypertension. And so that, this rate in overweight kids is concerning, given that is a major problem in our society. Also found in this paper was that over the 15 years from the year 2000, the rate of childhood hypertension increased by 75%, which is really quite a lot. So blood pressure is a thing in children. I guess the next question is, well, okay, it's a thing. Is it an important thing in children? the studies showing quite convincingly now that higher blood pressure in childhood leads to higher and steeper BP trajectories as you go into adulthood. So you can see this figure here from Theodore shows, elevated blood pressure may not look like a lot at 7 years of age, but that sets you on a track that leads to higher blood pressure as an adult. It's also now recognised that high blood pressure in childhood is the strongest predictor of adult hypertension, and if you couple that with the fact that adult hypertension is the leading risk factor for global disease burden, you start to join the dots, if you like, of how important blood pressure in children is. So, okay, is high blood pressure really an important thing in children? And, does it have an effect on their physiology? Is it causing problems? Well, there is evidence of adverse effects on physiology. Subclinical end organ damage. So children with high blood pressure have adaptations of their heart, or left ventricle, to the increased load that's experienced by that high blood pressure, which we see as an elevated left ventricular mass. The muscles working harder. Also, the artery walls are thicker and the central arteries are stiffer. And these are all precursors of cardiovascular disease in adults. There's also a paper that just came out recently which showed that children with high blood pressure, and even only moderately high blood pressure, display impaired left ventricular systolic and diastolic function with those different indices there, which is also very interesting and shows that there's a whole gamut of effects of high blood pressure. So, showing that picture on the right, there's a lot of dots that are forming to form a picture that shows how important this is. Some further dots that are in place, or lines that are in place between dots, is that high blood pressure in childhood is associated with end organ damage in adulthood. So if you follow children into adulthood, you see that those with hypertension have sustained left ventricular hypertrophy. These thicker arterial walls are found, and also the stiffer central arteries. So it's not just something you see in children, and that carries over to adults as well. But I guess people still look at this and say, well, what about, the real endpoints? And so is high blood pressure really a very important thing in children? And I think hopefully with this slide, the picture will start to become even clearer. And we know that some studies here showing that adolescents with high blood pressure have a greater risk of developing adult hypertension, which we know is a great risk, a very significant risk factor for heart disease, metabolic syndrome, left ventricular hypertrophy. And now there's also emerging evidence of a greater risk for incident coronary heart disease, acute myocardial infarction, and stroke. And so these are actually hard endpoints. There's still developing evidence in that. And I heard recently a seminar of some very exciting data coming out of the I3C consortium, which will shed further light on this. So that's very exciting. And there's also been some studies in 18-year-olds, so the later adolescents, showing an association with cardiovascular mortality. So if you look at hazard ratios of 1.28 and 1.51 for stage 1 and 2 hypertension over this very, very long follow-up, it really shows the relevance of childhood blood pressure. So hopefully I'm starting to convince you of the importance of looking at blood pressure, not just in adults, but in children as well. And so I guess the next question is, what can we do about it? Now, I'm not a medical specialist who treats children, but I'll briefly go over some of the things. The first thing I think we need to do is measure blood pressure in children and adolescents, because if we're not measuring it, we really can't identify those children at greatest risk. The other thing we need to do is measure blood pressure well in children and adolescents. And I'll talk a bit more about that later and bring some of our own research into that discussion, because there are some challenges with that. We then also need to determine the etiology of the hypertension when it's found, because there are different causes and some of them require different treatments. So primary hypertension, which is most often related to overweight. Chronic kidney disease is a big one in children, and then other conditions like coarctation, which is a form of congenital heart disease, and a whole series of other rare conditions. And I'll refer you to Professor Flynn's clinical practice guidelines for all the details on those, and also the European guidelines that I've put there. And then in terms of reducing blood pressure in children, I think, you know, sometimes there's a bit of caution about, well, what can we do if we find hypertension in children? Well, there are things we can do. Lifestyle interventions such as healthy diet, really encouraging physical activity and exercise, and reducing salt intake. And if required, antihypertensive medications may be required and may be quite effective. And Professor Flynn, I think, can tell you all about that. I'm not an expert on that side of things. So I'll talk a little bit now about the challenges of blood pressure measurement. One of the big ones is white coat hypertension, which is where the child is found to be hypertensive in the doctor's office, but due to the stress of that, they're not actually hypertensive if you do a 24-hour ambulatory measurement. And so that's a significant number. 50%, that's 50% of children who are found to be hypertensive in the clinic may not actually be hypertensive. So ambulatory monitoring is really essential to confirm that diagnosis. Ambulatory monitoring can also show up masked hypertension, in other words, hypertension that's found on ABPM, but not in the doctor's office. So that there's a study by Lerb showing that 1 in 13, or over 7% of children, just in the general community, had masked hypertension, which is really quite a lot. And she showed that it was also related to development of LV hypertrophy. So again, pointing to the importance of ambulatory monitoring. But then ambulatory monitoring itself has its own challenges in children. And that relates to the fact that you have to have a cuff on the arm, squeeze their arm every 20 minutes or so, day and night for that whole day. And so that can cause pain, it can cause embarrassment if it's worn at school, and it can cause sleep disturbance. And so there's a study by Hamdani showing that in 14 to 16-year-olds, almost a third of the children were intolerant in some way. So that's really been a key finding for us driving some of our research, and we've been exploring the potential for cuffless blood pressure monitoring, which is a very exciting new technology that's just emerging, and it really requires a lot more development and a lot more validation. But we did some preliminary studies showing a very good relationship and very consistent relationship between something called pulse arrival time, which doesn't require a cuff, and a change in systolic blood pressure. So this was during an exercise test. So on the left, you've got one individual, and on the right, you've got the regression lines from, I think it's 32 or 35 individuals. So you can see it's very consistent. And so that sort of information that can be obtained without a cuff could possibly be used to replace the cuff or for the ambulatory monitoring. So that's exciting, but it's a work in progress. The other factor that needs to be considered is the accuracy of automated devices. So the gold standard non-invasive technique, which all the reference values are based on, is the manual auscultatory method. But in practice, many people use automated devices, which use a different principle of measurement, and the ambulatory devices all use this technique. So that's one thing, but then with these automated devices, there are many of them, many different brands, and each brand has its own algorithm inside it, which we don't really know how it works necessarily. And we did a study of ambulatory blood pressure in children and young adults after coarctation repair. And we were very confused by the results in that we used one device, the Oscar 2. If you just focus on the red points here, we used a Space Labs and we found completely different results. The blood pressures were much lower. And then we thought, well, we better do another measurement to see if that was real. So we did another measurement with the Oscar 2 and found pretty similar results to the initial run. And so this really suggested that there was a fairly big device dependency in these measurements. So that emphasises the need for devices to be validated and for reference values to be established for a particular device. Running out of time, but I'll just run through a few more things. So there is a paucity of validated devices in children, and that's a big gap really as well. There's a website called stridebp.org, which has a number of devices listed there specifically for children, which are recommended and validated. So I recommend you have a look at that. But one of the disappointing things is that there are not more devices on that list. There are really a few devices there. The other thing that we're interested in is the absolute accuracy of blood pressure. And when we say absolute, we mean versus the true invasive blood pressure. And it stands to reason that that true invasive pressure would be most closely related to risk. So in the long term, we're hoping to improve the accuracy of blood pressure in that sense. And we've done some studies of central blood pressure, and this is a figure from Dean Picone, who's in the audience, from one of his papers looking at the accuracy of oscillometric and other devices for predicting the central blood pressure, the invasive central blood pressure. And you can see the systolic blood pressure as you get older, the pulse pressure and diastolic pressure are underestimated more, and for systolic and pulse, and for diastolic blood pressure, it's overestimated. But in younger adults, those differences are less. Now, one of the really interesting findings of our KidCore BP study was that if you extrapolate this data, which we didn't know about at the time of our study, you find that in children, the oscillometric devices, we tested two different devices and they both had similar results. They both overestimated systolic blood pressure, which was quite different to what you see in adults, whereas diastolic blood pressure was quite good. And it's interesting that was could have been predicted from an extrapolation of Dean's data. So there could be potential there for correcting some of these issues. We're also interested in on a similar vein, auscultatory blood pressure measurements, and there's been some controversy around the definition of diastolic blood pressure, whether we should use K4, the muffling, or the K5, the disappearance of sounds. And there's some data from 1963, quite a long time ago, showing that the correlation between invasive diastolic and K4 is pretty poor. It's 0.36, and the differences, would not pass validation by today's standards. Similarly, for K5, the correlation was similar, maybe slightly less. The accuracy was slightly better, but the precision was even worse than K4. So K4 overestimated, K5 underestimated the invasive diastolic blood pressure. So there's some questions around that and how that might I guess, reduce our ability to really predict risk in children. I'll just probably skip over this. So we've looked at similar questions during exercise and just found that K5 is often undetectable under exercise conditions. In 43% of cases, you really can't get a K5, and that's what's recommended for use at the moment. So that's a bit of a problem. We're also looking into, and this is my PhD student, Melanie Clark, is looking into interarm blood pressure differences. And the guidelines have something in there about measuring in both arms, but there's not a lot of evidence to give us indication of how important these interarm differences are. And so we've looked at that at rest and also under exercise conditions. And you do see IAD plus, which we define as greater than 10 millimeters of mercury, in quite a significant number of children at rest, and then a very, very large proportion, almost a third, under exercise conditions. So just to sum up, I've given a bit of a whirlwind tour and some little peeks at some of the research we've done. But just to summarise, I think we need more evidence of the importance of paediatric blood pressure with respect to lifelong risk. I presented some of that data, but we definitely need more to convince the wider medical community of the need to measure blood pressure in children. There's work underway, as far as I understand, for developing risk-based threshold values in children, as opposed to the percentile thresholds that we have at the moment. We need more studies around design and efficacy of blood pressure lowering interventions. We need more fundamental studies seeking to improve the accuracy of paediatric blood pressure. We need more validated devices, and we need more clarity around some of the mechanisms and significance of these interarm differences. We need devices that are better tolerated by children, and I'll finish with this one. We need doctors to measure blood pressure in children. I'll just acknowledge my team here who contributed to much of this work, and on the right there I've got some of my clinical collaborators and mentors, and thank you for your attention, and there's some of my funding sources that I acknowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Anybody has any questions for him? Not, I'll start with one. Jonathan, what is the common cause of the pediatric blood pressure that you've come across in your,
So you mean a common cause for pediatric hypertension?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah,
so there's chronic kidney disease is a very common one. And then it's associated with overweight and obesity. Professor Flynn is probably much more qualified than I am to answer this question. But there's quite a range of different factors. Some of them are quite rare, but that can lead to hypertension. Do you want to add anything to that, Professor Flynn?
I mean, mostly it's like in adults, there is no identifiable cause. And maybe they have a familial tendency. We've shown that in some of our work. And the contribution of excess weight is important as well. But we've shown that after the age of 6, it's mostly primary hypertension.
I have a question, Rev, quickly.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jonathan, for this really great presentation. You definitely presented the importance of paediatric blood pressure. So you mentioned that perhaps we need to be doing more encouraging physical activity and the DASH diet and so on. But we know in Australia that about 75% of Australian kids don't meet the physical activity guidelines, and nearly 100% of children are consuming above the upper limit of recommended sodium intake. So do we perhaps need to be targeting these behaviours as well, do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. This is not my area, but absolutely, we need to be doing that, and I think it's a key challenge that we face. It's not an easy answer to change people's behaviour, their eating habits, their physical activity habits. It's really not easy to do, and may require some policy changes, may require some smart research by people like yourself, and yeah, a lot more work there to be done. Yeah.
May I ask a question, Ravanti? Jonathan, great presentation. I'm just curious, from the studies you presented in terms of prevalence of MAST and just hypertension in general, would you be able to comment? I mean, that's based on prospective studies or randomized controlled trials. So we don't really know the true prevalence if we can't get doctors to measure blood pressure. Is that right? Or am I misunderstanding the presentation?
Yeah, so the MAST, I have to cast my mind back, but the study by Lerb, MAST hypertension, I believe that was just in the general community, but not in Australia. And then the other one, which was, sorry, of general hypertension or
Yes,
white coat?
Yes.
Yeah,
no,
so general hypertension. So the figures I put up with a reference was a meta-analysis of global studies. So, you know, that took into account quite a few different studies from around the world. I don't know off the top of my head what the nature of those studies was. I would have to look that up. But yeah, I don't think we have enough information in Australia, for example.
If I could comment, so Empire's study was a few hundred kids from Valencia, Spain, where she is, and I think it was just a population study. There have been maybe one or two others that seem to show a similar prevalence of MAST hypertension in children. I think it's not quite, I don't know what you guys know, Anastasia, better, the prevalence in, you know, adults without a prior diagnosis of hypertension. But all the other ones are screening studies. And what's interesting, Jonathan, is about when you talked about the 1% incidence of stage 2 hypertension being greater than 140/90. So if you go back to the 1970s, before there were robust normative data for blood pressure in children, the prevalence of hypertension in children was thought to be 1% because they used 140/90 to define it.
Yeah.
And it's only if you have more robust normative data and you get a better idea of what the true prevalence is. Bonnie Faulkner has written about this and how just, you know, iterative reexamination of screening studies over the years has really gotten us to a much tighter understanding of the distribution of blood pressure in children and where the statistical prevalence of hypertension is. And we definitely need outcomes-based or risk-based data, and that's what we're trying to show in our ongoing Chippewa study. Thank you for mentioning a few of our papers that have been just coming out this year.
Mm.
Can I ask a question to the experts in children? Is high blood pressure in children related to end organ dysfunction like left ventricular hypertrophy? How is it categorized? How is hypertension in children categorized?
When you say categorized, do you mean
Like,
how
I
do
mean,
we
what are the signs apart from just being high? What does it do? What does high blood pressure in children do? In adults, you have left ventricular hypertrophy. There's other problems. What about in
so
children?
I presented there was some slides. There's one slide where I highlighted some of those issues. So increased LV mass is one of them. Increased aortic stiffness, IMT, and then the recent paper that came out about reduced you know, these are subclinical issues.
Is it the same degree as adults, or is it like, isn't there some compensation that happens in early years with growth and so on? Isn't that confounding? Isn't that a
yeah? So these will be. So it's hard to say whether these are, you know, these will be physiological remodeling, I imagine.
Yeah.
To some extent, but we don't know to what extent. So, for example, you know, the increase in LV mass will most likely be, as I said, due to the increased load that the heart is facing. But, you know, to what extent that is bad, over time, one would assume it is bad because it seems to be associated with LV hypertrophy in adults and then events. So, yeah. Not sure if I answered your question there.
But. I just wonder the degree of adapt. You know, how do things adapt? There's a sort of adaptive changes that happen with growth at a certain point.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of
over, you know,
in terms of atherosclerosis, you know, it's been found that very early, and you probably know this already, but very early in age, and I think even you know, from infancy, there's fatty streaks starting to form on the arterial wall, this sort of thing. So there does seem to be a ramp that people are starting to climb from a very young age that eventually leads to that atherosclerosis. Yeah.
Because some of those that work done in the early years by Berry and Stephen Greenwald, they looked at elastin, laying down of elastin before birth, you know, and if there are genetic modifications before birth, after birth, they don't adapt, and so there is this, you know, vascular changes that happen very early that happen, and so it's the adaptive mechanisms that don't seem to work properly in some of these kids, and they're obviously adults as well, you know. So I'm just wondering if there's, you know, some of the genetic markers that could be used and so on. So
I mean, one thing I didn't mention, which I was going to, was one of the encouraging things is that some of these changes we see, if you reduce blood pressure, there's evidence that some of these changes will reverse. So the thickening of the arterial wall and LV mass will regress if we deal with the high blood pressure. So that's an additional motivation to identify that and intervene, I think.
Can I maybe comment on that question? So if we think about early vascular aging, the concept of early vascular aging, I think that is also quite important, because some individuals have a kind of protective phenotype where this remodeling mechanisms are enhanced, you know, to adapt to environmental conditions. Whereas individuals with a more unfavorable environment and even in intrauterine programming have this predisposition of developing vascular complications at a much earlier age compared to their peers. So I think early vascular aging gives us that kind of idea of the mechanisms in place to remodel to your immediate environment. I think also in terms of microvascular phenotypes in children can kind of explain some of these early onset hypertensive phenotypes in children, where smaller retinal arterioles do predict hypertension. And we can see that similar in children as for adults. And some of our colleagues and also colleagues in Switzerland focus on these retinal microvascular changes in children and have seen that these are adversely affected in children that are obese, that are physically inactive. So I think in general, everything comes back to primary prevention, I think, and of course, even more important, primordial prevention.
Thanks for that, Ruan. Anybody else? Any questions?
Good question. So Jonathan and maybe Dean would want to comment too. I've really been struggling when I get papers to review that are trying to relate central blood pressure to brachial blood pressure in children, and trying to relate central blood pressure to target organ damage, and using devices that have little or no, validation or normative data, and perhaps, different methodologies. And so I guess, question is, where do you think the state of the knowledge is in terms of measurement, non-invasive measurement of central blood pressure in children? Are the devices there yet? And can we really start using them either, well, of course you could use them in research, right? Because you could try anything, but whether there may be any clinical utility to measuring that in children. So I guess that's about 3 or 4 questions, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. We've tested now 3 different devices. 2 we published in the KidCore BP paper, and a third, which is the Watch BP from MicroLife. So these 3 devices that unfortunately all of them have not passed the validation against invasive. So, and that's not just an offset, it's also a variability. So the standard deviation is not acceptable either, which suggests the precision is not there yet. We've found that using the more traditional technique, which is radial tonometry, so it's not an automated device anymore. It's using a tonometer and calibrating that. We can actually get quite a good estimate of central pressure, but that's typically not what people are using these days. They like slapping on a cuff and pressing a button, and unfortunately that's not sufficiently accurate at this stage, in our finding anyway.
Okay, and I think we are well in time. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Jonathan. Good luck with your adventure with the cuffless blood pressure monitoring. And yes, thank you all of you for joining us today.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Jonathan.